Waitress? On that piano? Please, don't embarrass yourself. When a world-famous pianist mocks a humble waitress in front of an elite crowd, no one expects what happens next. But as Eliza Holloway quietly walks toward the grand piano, apron still around her waist, she unleashes a performance so haunting, it brings the entire room to its feet and reveals a buried family legacy that shakes the music world to its core. This is the story of a daughter's resilience, a father's forgotten genius, and a silence that turned into a global symphony. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. Don't tell me you actually thought you could serve and think at the same time, Marcus Vance sneered, dabbing at the cuff of his pristine jacket with a starched linen napkin. His voice rang with smug cruelty, like the crack of an expensive whip. Or wait, was this your big audition? The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it stung like a slap. The kind of laugh that travels across a room, not because it's funny, but because people are afraid not to laugh when power is speaking. The soft murmurs, the high-pitched scoffs from the elegantly dressed dinner guests, and the smug tilt of Marcus's chin all fused into one slow-motion moment for Eliza. She stood frozen beside the table, still clutching the now half-empty water carafe, her thin white blouse damp where droplets had splashed during the accidental spill. Her heart thudded, not fast, but heavy, like it was dragging something behind it. Marcus leaned back in his velvet-backed chair, his fingers twirling the stem of a crystal wine glass as he examined her the way one might examine a cracked figurine at an antique store, curious but dismissive. "What's your name again?" he asked, pretending to care. "Eliza," she replied softly, her voice barely above the background notes of ambient jazz playing from the corner speaker. "Eliza," he repeated, as if testing the sound of a mistake. "Pretty name. Shame it's wasted on someone who doesn't understand how coordination works. Tell me, Eliza, do you also butcher the piano like you do table service?" There it was, the word piano, the word that hadn't touched her ears in over 6 years. Until now, when it was weaponized as an insult. A jolt of memory hit her like a pinprick to the skin, her father's voice, calm and deep, saying, "Let the silence lead you into the first note, Eliza. Always let the silence breathe first." But here, there was no silence, just ridicule. The table of suited executives and bored socialites chuckled again. One woman leaned toward Marcus and whispered something. He grinned and waved her off like a magician denying how a trick was done. Eliza stepped back quietly, lips pressed together. The carafe was still trembling in her grip, and she quickly returned it to the serving station before someone saw. Her shoes squeaked faintly on the polished marble floor, an accidental, awkward exit marked by the soft click of heels and humiliation. Back in the kitchen, the sounds shifted, clang of steel trays, bursts of steam, barked orders from chefs. But the laughter echoed in her mind like it had followed her in. She stood near the industrial sink, breathing shallowly, staring down at her hands. The same hands that once played Chopin in her sleep. Now they smelled like dish soap and garlic butter. Eliza? Rosa, a petite woman with warm eyes and a quick tongue, placed a hand on her arm. "Ignore him. These rich types don't know what real talent looks like." Eliza didn't respond right away. She just shook her head and tried to smile. "It's fine. I spilled water. It's my fault." "No, his arrogance is the problem." Rosa narrowed her eyes. "He called you a joke. That man wouldn't know music if Beethoven kicked him in the chest." Eliza managed a laugh, thin as it was, but something inside her was tightening. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not seriously. Not since the funeral. Not since the bills started piling up and her mother stopped singing to herself in the kitchen. She remembered the day she gave up her conservatory acceptance letter, folded it twice, and placed it in the trash without a word. It felt like swallowing glass, and yet here she was. In the same building as Marcus Vance, the maestro of Manhattan, the man who filled Carnegie Hall and graced the cover of Virtuoso magazine, and he had just made her the punchline of a joke. "Eliza," someone called from the kitchen door. It was the event coordinator, pacing like she was chasing time itself. "Quick, do you play piano?" The question landed like a hammer. Eliza blinked. "What? The performer we hired for dinner canceled last minute. the woman said, frantic. "The baby grand in the ballroom is already set. The mic is live. We need something. Anything." Eliza opened her mouth, then closed it. Rosa was already nudging her forward. "She plays like an angel." The coordinator looked her over with a flick of mild skepticism. "You sure? This is a luxury charity dinner. We've got billionaires in there." "I haven't played in a long time," Eliza whispered. "Do you remember how to?" The woman pressed, exasperated. Eliza hesitated. "Yes," she said. The coordinator didn't ask more. She just gestured toward the hallway and said, "God help us. Go." As Eliza stepped out from the staff hallway and back into the luminous ballroom, the air shifted. The candlelight glowed a little too bright. The distant chimes of silverware echoed too clearly. Her breath caught. The baby grand piano sat under a suspended glass chandelier, lit gently from above like a spotlight had found it by accident. It was glossy black, pristine, waiting. Marcus sat only a few tables away from it, half-turned in his chair, sipping wine. When he saw her, his brow arched. "Oh no," he murmured under his breath, grinning. "This should be adorable." The words made their way to her ears, but she didn't flinch. Each step toward the piano felt like walking through memories. The recital when she was 12 and her shoes squeaked louder than her performance. The night her father placed a silent kiss on her head after she nailed Liszt's La Campanella. The winter she stayed up all night with frost-bitten fingers, practicing until she could no longer feel her knuckles. She stood at the bench, removed her apron. Slowly, with care, she ran her fingers across the keys, unplayed, untouched, waiting like an old friend. The room wasn't silent, but it felt like it had stopped breathing. Marcus chuckled loudly. "Oh, come on," he called out, raising his glass. "Don't be shy, let's hear what she's got. Chopsticks, maybe?" A few scattered laughs again, but less this time. Even cruelty sounded unsure. Eliza sat, closed her eyes, and waited. The silence before the first note. Just like her father taught her, she let it breathe, let it stretch, let the noise behind her fall into the background, like curtains being drawn. Then her fingers moved. Not fast, not loud, just honest. The first few notes curled into the air like warm smoke, sweet and slow. Then came the second phrase, then the third. Her hands grew steadier, her posture rising. Her back straightened and the music bloomed. She didn't play for the crowd. She didn't play for Marcus. She played for the years she lost, the dreams she buried, the voice of her father she could still hear on quiet nights. She played because once, music was the only thing that ever made sense, and for the first time in years it felt like speaking a language she hadn't forgotten after all. Behind her, the ballroom slowly fell still. Marcus no longer smiled. His glass was lowered, forgotten on the tablecloth. Eliza's hands danced over the keys, the music unfurling like it had always lived in the space between her ribs. And just like that, the room belonged to her. The moment her final note lingered in the air, soft, like a breath exhaled by the soul itself, Eliza lifted her hands from the keys, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It throbbed with emotion, pulsed with something unspoken. It wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be filled. It was reverent, sacred, like everyone in the room instinctively knew that clapping too soon would break something fragile. And for the briefest moment, she remained still, eyes closed, head bowed over the keys, as though offering a prayer in sound. Then she stood. Not a single person moved, except Marcus. He sat frozen in his seat, fingers tightened around his wineglass, the crimson liquid inside tilting dangerously toward the rim. His brow was furrowed, not in anger, but in confusion, even disbelief. He knew that peace. Every rise, every unexpected suspension, every painful aching chord shift, it was his. Or rather, it was almost his. Because he'd never performed it, never published it, never played it outside a locked studio 20 years ago. Not even his current audience had heard it. And yet somehow, this waitress, this no-name slip of a girl with her hair tied back in a simple band, had just brought it to life. Exactly as he once dreamed it. And more hauntingly than he'd ever managed. The spell cracked with a single sound. A fork fell from someone's hand and clattered onto the floor. The room startled back into motion like a crowd waking from a collective dream. One guest let out a whispered, "My God." Another touched her hand to her chest as if steadying a too-fast heartbeat. Applause began, but it wasn't a polite ripple. It surged. A standing ovation from executives in bespoke suits, From wives in evening gowns worth more than Eliza's entire year of tips. From donors, from planners, from strangers who didn't know her name but suddenly felt as if they'd heard her, truly heard her, for the first time. Eliza's chest tightened, not in pride, but in grief. In awe. In disbelief that the music still lived in her after all this time. That it hadn't abandoned her like she once thought. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply returned to the kitchen, walking slowly, as if floating through the edges of a memory she wasn't ready to leave behind. But just before the swinging kitchen door closed behind her, she heard something unexpected. "Wait," a voice called, loud and clear. "Marcus." The applause faltered. Some turned toward him, confused. His face was a study in contradiction, shocked, unsure, and desperate not to show it. "Where did you learn that piece?" he asked. Eliza stopped, her hand resting on the steel edge of the kitchen door. She didn't turn around. "My father," she said quietly. It took a second for the words to register. Then the air changed again. Marcus's expression twitched. His grip on the wineglass loosened, and for a moment he looked suddenly older. Less maestro, more man. "Your father," he echoed. "Who was your father?" She finally turned, eyes locked on him. Not with anger, not with pity, with clarity. "Samuel Holloway," the room gasped. A woman at Marcus's table audibly said, "No," as if the name itself had weight. And it did. Samuel Holloway had once been the whispered name in elite music circles. A young, meteoric talent who studied under Marcus in his earlier, hungrier years. A composer of aching genius. But his life had unraveled after a tragic accident and personal hardships. His music never published, his promise never fulfilled. And now, here stood his daughter, playing a melody the world never got to hear. Marcus leaned back slowly, expression unreadable. Eliza didn't wait for his response. She pushed through the kitchen door, and the moment she crossed back into the clamor of pots and orders and fluorescent lights, the applause, still going, became muffled again. Like a dream sealed behind a curtain. She braced herself against the counter, eyes closed. Her breath was shallow, but steadying. Rosa was there in an instant, her face radiant, tears on her cheeks. "Dios mío, Eliza, what did you do out there?" "I just played." "No," Rosa said fiercely, grabbing her by the shoulders. "You didn't just play. You made every person in that room feel something they didn't know they were missing." Eliza shook her head, still unsure. "It wasn't mine. It was his, my father's. You were his. That music was yours too." Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open again. The event coordinator entered, flushed and flustered. "There you are," she said. "We need you back out there now." Eliza blinked. "Why?" "There's a man here from Ardent Conservatory. He heard you play. He thought they had hired you as the entertainment. He wants to speak to you." Eliza's knees nearly gave out. "No, that must be a mistake." "Are you kidding?" the woman snapped. "You just turned a charity dinner into a transcendent concert. Marcus Vance hasn't said a word in 3 minutes. You've silenced a man who talks in his sleep." Rosa beamed. "Go." Eliza stared down at her apron, still damp, wrinkled, marked with grease from earlier in the night. "I can't go out like this." "You're not going out as a waitress," Rosa said, untying the apron from behind. "You're going out as who you were always meant to be." The words hit deeper than Rosa could have known, because Eliza remembered who she was supposed to be. A performer, a composer, a soul who lived in music not beneath the weight of rent, notices, and night shifts. She walked out again. No apron, no tray, no fear. The ballroom didn't quiet because someone asked it to. It quieted because it felt her arrive. Marcus was still seated, but his expression had changed. He didn't look furious. He looked haunted. The kind of haunted that only comes from realizing you've buried something precious and someone just dug it up. The man waiting near the stage was tall, silver-haired, with a leather-bound notebook and the sharp, curious eyes of a talent scout who hadn't blinked in 15 years. He introduced himself with a name she barely registered, because the next words made the room tilt. "Have you considered coming back?" he asked. "To music?" She tried to answer, but no sound came. "I know who your father was. He submitted pieces once anonymously. We never knew where they came from, but we archived them. That piece you played tonight, it was his, wasn't it?" "Yes," Eliza said, her voice trembling. "I finished it." The man smiled slowly, reverently. "We've been waiting to hear the rest." The weight of the scout's words hovered in the air like smoke from a candle recently extinguished. We've been waiting to hear the rest. How do you respond to something like that when your whole life has been composed in silence? Eliza stood there, unsure if she was supposed to smile, collapse, or run. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, before she could even breathe in the right direction, the hush was interrupted by a single, measured clap. Then another, and another. But this time it wasn't for her. Marcus Vance was standing, slow, deliberate, his hands now joining in a solitary sardonic applause, each clap echoing through the marble and chandeliers like a slow, bitter rain. Everyone turned toward him. His smile wasn't joy, it was sharp, polished, and glinting with something unspoken. Not rage, something colder. Bruised pride masquerading as civility. "Well then," he said, voice smooth like poured oil, "I suppose even waitstaff can get lucky." A few gasps escaped from the crowd, but no one dared respond. The scout glanced toward Marcus with raised brows, his polite expression slipping ever so slightly. Eliza didn't blink, didn't move. But inside, the old tremble stirred again, the instinct to step back, to apologize, to disappear. Marcus's gaze was fixed on her now, his stare a silent challenge. "You played it well," he added, his voice just loud enough. "But I know that piece. I wrote it." No one spoke, not even the scout. Marcus stepped forward a few paces, wine glass still in hand, posture flawless. "Of course," he continued, "not in ink, not officially. But I composed it, years ago. It was an idea I abandoned, or perhaps it was taken. Interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say?" There it was, the unspoken accusation. He was staking a quiet, calculated claim to what had just stunned the room, reaching back into the spotlight without outright snatching it, casting a shadow of doubt just long enough to rattle her. Eliza's heart thudded once, and then it stopped thudding, because something deeper kicked in, something colder, something stronger. She stepped forward. "I know it," she said softly, "because I grew up listening to it. Not from you, but from the man who actually wrote it, Samuel Holloway, my father." The scout's eyes widened, guests leaned in. Marcus froze mid-sip, the wine suddenly looking like blood against the pale stem of his glass. He used to hum that melody when he was cooking eggs. He played it on a second-hand upright piano with a chipped G key. I heard him revise it 100 times before he died. Her voice wavered, but not from fear. From memory, from reverence. Marcus set the glass down. "And I remember," she continued, "the day he came home from your mentorship program, with a bruise on his ego and silence in his throat. You told him he wasn't ready. You told him his music lacked polish, but it was never about polish, was it?" The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels hot against the skin. Eliza kept going, her voice no longer shaking. "You shelved him, Mr. Vance. You crushed him. He gave up trying to be seen, and you got to keep your seat at the table." Marcus's jaw worked slightly, but he said nothing. "Now I'm here," she finished. No triumph in her tone, just truth. The scout took a slow step toward her and said, gently, "Would you excuse us for just a moment, Mr. Vance?" The maestro hesitated, but the power had shifted. He gave a short, clipped nod, then turned back toward his table, his shoulders straighter than ever. But his back looked smaller somehow. The scout looked at her with a strange combination of wonder and weight. "Listen," he said, his tone private now. "That piece, we had it in our archives, an unsigned submission. We assumed it was an early experiment from one of our composers, but no one ever claimed it. We've referenced it in workshops for years, called it the Ghost Waltz." Eliza almost laughed at that. "He called it Midnight Memory," she whispered, "because he'd only ever play it at night." The scout's smile broke into something warm and full. "Eliza," he said slowly, "I want to offer you something real. I can't undo what's been taken from your family, but I can give you the space to finish what your father started. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship, conservatory placement, and, if you're willing, an opportunity to debut your own work in our winter showcase." The offer didn't feel real. The lights above seemed too bright, the air too still. Her hands? They didn't know where to rest. For years they only carried trays. Balanced wine, scrubbed pots. Now they were being asked to write symphonies. She started, then stopped. Her lips parted again, still unable to believe she was breathing in a world where this was possible. A full scholarship. A seat at the table she once gave up. But the past didn't disappear that easily. She thought of her mother working double shifts at the grocery, of the months when they rationed heat. Of the day she pawned her father's old metronome just to afford the power bill. She thought of everything it cost to survive without music. The scout noticed her hesitation. "If you need time," he said gently. She shook her head. "No, I need to make sure I can still live in that world, that it wasn't a fluke." "Then why don't you play something of your own?" he offered. "Right now. No pressure, no spotlight, just you." Eliza looked at the piano again. It sat there, gleaming and silent, like a promise. She walked over. Marcus watched her this time but didn't speak. She sat once more. No apron, no tray, no shame. This time she didn't play her father's notes, she played her own. A trembling melody at first, delicate and questioning, like a voice waking up after years of silence. But it grew. A melody that reached, wandered, stumbled, and then soared. Like a story of a girl who once served champagne to strangers and now served something far more rare. Herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And when she finished, this time the silence wasn't reverent. It was electric. Like every person in that room knew something extraordinary had just begun. The final note shivered into stillness, and Eliza didn't move. Her fingers lingered over the keys like they still needed to feel something. The vibration, the connection, the truth of what she had just set free. She stared ahead, but her gaze wasn't in the room. It was somewhere between memory and awakening. The crowd behind her didn't erupt. Not yet. There was no polite clapping this time. Just stillness. Raw, wounded, holy. Because what Eliza played wasn't entertainment. It was confession. A woman near the bar clutched the pearls at her throat and wept silently. A man in a tailored blue suit whispered to the person beside him, "That wasn't a performance. That was a lifetime." The scout had removed his glasses, cleaning them with the edge of his sleeve, not because they were dirty, but because his eyes were misting and he didn't want it to show. Even Marcus hadn't moved. He sat still, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, but not in contempt, in calculation, in recognition, in the slow, reluctant awe that comes when you realize you've been eclipsed not by competition, but by something unteachable. Eliza rose slowly from the bench. She didn't look for applause. She didn't need it. Her chest felt like it was both on fire and hollowed out, the kind of ache that follows catharsis. She had spilled something sacred into the world tonight, and it would never go back. She turned to leave the piano, but the scout stood waiting. Not clapping, just present. "That," he said quietly, "was not a fluke." She nodded once. Her throat was too tight to speak. "You were born for this," he added, and in his tone was no flattery, only fact. Around them, the crowd began to recover from their awe. Some began to clap again, slowly at first, as though uncertain if applause could honor what had just happened. Others remained silent, hands pressed to their hearts or folded in front of them. They knew they'd witnessed something rare. The kind of moment you told stories about years later with the phrase, "I was there when." But Marcus rose slowly and approached the piano. Eliza noticed his footsteps before she saw his face. Measured. Careful. Like a man walking through fog, trying to trace what had once been his. "I see it now," he murmured when he reached her. His voice no longer sharp, no longer mocking, just quieter. "It was never just your father." She met his eyes. He looked different, smaller, not in stature, but in presence. As if the performance had peeled away the practiced layers of brilliance and arrogance and left behind something bare, something unmasked. "You carry him in your hands," Marcus said, glancing at the keys. "But the rest is you." Her heart beat. She thought she heard something genuine. Then he added, "You understand this changes things." Her body stiffened. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head. "That composition, it was never officially copyrighted. It was workshopped, yes, shared in draft, but never claimed. And now it's out in the world." A cold note ran down her spine. "You're saying you're going to claim it?" Her voice was ice, restrained only by sheer will. Marcus raised his palm slowly. "I'm saying it was unfinished business, work that existed in a kind of limbo, and you brought it back. Brilliantly. But music is complicated when it lives in the gray." The scout stepped forward then, the steel returning to his voice. "She has a recording, a time-stamped one from this performance. You heard it." "We all did." Marcus didn't argue. He just smiled faintly. "Then I hope you understand the attention this will draw. Eliza may be stepping into a world that worships her tonight, but tomorrow? Tomorrow the vultures wake up." And with that, he turned and walked away. Not victorious, but not defeated either. Just recalculating. Eliza stood still, the warmth from the piano bench already fading beneath her. The applause had returned in full now, louder than before, as if the guests had collectively realized that despite the tension, the moment needed to be honored. But her mind wasn't in it anymore. Not completely. Rosa appeared at her side like a miracle. "I saw the whole thing," she said breathlessly, eyes wide and wet. "You, Eliza, I don't even have words. You made them all feel it. Even him." Eliza tried to smile. "It's not over yet." "No," Rosa agreed. "It's just beginning." But Eliza's thoughts were racing. Her heart was still stuck on Marcus's warning, a whisper that had managed to steal some of the air out of her lungs. Tomorrow, the vultures wake up. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Because now the world knew her name. Now, she wasn't a quiet server in the background anymore. She was a story. And stories, when they go public, get picked apart. They get rewritten, claimed, challenged, repackaged, and sold. The scout watched her silently, as if he too understood what had just shifted. He handed her a business card and said only, "When you're ready, we'll make sure your voice is heard. On your terms." She nodded. It was a lifeline, and a heavy one. Later, after the dinner had ended and the hall had emptied out, Eliza remained behind. The piano was still there. So was Marcus. He lingered at the bar, drink untouched, staring at the keys like they were relics of a life he no longer controlled. She approached without meaning to. "Do you remember," she asked quietly, "the first time you heard my father play?" He didn't look at her. He played with fire. No restraint, no boundaries. "You said that like it was a flaw." He finally turned to her. "I said it because I didn't know how to live without walls." She waited. "You were right," he admitted. "I buried him. I buried the peace. I buried the truth. Because he scared me. His music was alive in ways mine never was." Eliza's breath caught. He finished the drink without tasting it, set the glass down gently, and said, "But you frighten me more." "Good," she replied, steady. They stood in that silence for a long moment, and then she left him there, alone with the music he never understood. Backstage, under dim lights and exposed rafters, she sat on a stool, Rosa beside her. Her hands, still tingling, rested in her lap. "What now?" Rosa asked softly. Eliza didn't have a plan, but she had something better. "I play," she whispered. "I write. I finish what he couldn't, and then I start what's mine." Outside, the city had no idea what had just happened, but it would soon. The days that followed moved like a slow crescendo, rising with quiet intensity, each moment another measure in a piece Eliza hadn't expected to perform. The memory of the gala burned behind her eyes in fragments. The shimmer of the chandelier, the keys under her fingers, Marcus's twisted smile, the scout's voice saying, "We've been waiting to hear the rest." She tried to go back to the diner the next morning, tried to slip into the apron again, to disappear behind coffee refills and burnt toast orders, but something inside her had changed. The silence in the early morning no longer felt comforting. It felt vacant. Her hands, once steady while balancing trays, now twitched with a different rhythm. Her ears picked up melodies in everything. The clink of cutlery, the hum of traffic, the fluttering cadence of a customer's laugh, and her mind translated it all into sound, like her soul had turned into a score constantly begging to be written. Rosa noticed first. "You're not here anymore," she said gently, sliding a plate of pancakes onto a table. "You're still standing next to me, but your heart's already gone." Eliza looked down at the order pad in her hand. The words blurred. The columns didn't matter anymore. "I don't know where I'm going," she confessed. Rosa smiled. Then followed the music. That evening, Eliza stood alone in the tiny apartment she shared with her mother. The walls were thin, the ceiling water-stained, and the small upright piano in the corner sat like a forgotten friend. Dusty, chipped, the keys yellowed by time and air and grief. She pulled off the dust cover slowly, fingers brushing the ridges like a reunion. Her mother's old tea mug still sat atop the instrument, now dry and cracked. A single photograph was wedged behind the metronome. Her father, young and laughing, bent over a music stand, baton in one hand, a half-burnt cigarette in the other. Eliza sat on the bench. She didn't play at first. She just let her palms rest on the keys, letting the wood remember her weight, letting herself belong again. Then she played. Not her father's piece, not her own. Something new, something unformed but brave. Each note was unsure, but she followed it anyway. A melody born from dust, from second shifts, and forgotten scholarships, and years of wondering if she'd ever get to be more than a ghost in someone else's world. She played until the apartment felt too small for the sound, until her mother came out of the bedroom, eyes wide, clutching a robe around her. "Eliza?" "I couldn't stop," Eliza whispered. Tears rimmed her mother's eyes. "I didn't want you to." And just like that, the silence they'd both lived in for years shattered, broken not by grief or blame, but by music that filled the space between them with forgiveness. The next morning her phone rang. It was the scout. "Ardent Conservatory," he said, skipping greetings, "has made you an offer. A formal, recorded contract. They want you, not just as a student, as a voice." Her throat went dry. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes." She didn't hesitate this time. Yes. But with the offer came the noise. The headlines spread faster than she expected. First on music blogs, then arts columns, then the national papers. "Waitress stuns elite gala guests with unfinished ghost waltz." Is this the hidden prodigy Marcus Vance tried to silence? Daughter of forgotten composer reclaims lost masterpiece. Photos of her playing circulated, some blurry, some angelic, her face lost in the moment, her fingers caught mid-flight. Suddenly, people she'd never met were arguing about her in comment threads. Critics debated the origins of the piece. Internet sleuths dug up old faculty rosters, found Samuel Holloway's name listed under Vance's early mentees. A clip of her performance from a guest's phone went viral. And then came Marcus's interview. He appeared on a late-night music podcast, calm and calculated. "It's a touching story," he said. "And I won't deny the girl has talent. But music isn't inherited. It's earned. I merely worry that the public is confusing nostalgia with innovation. This piece, it was always incomplete for a reason." Eliza watched the clip in silence, not with rage, with resolve. She turned off the screen and opened her father's old music journals. Pages of hand-drawn notes, corrections in red ink, strange symbols only he understood. She traced each measure like reading a letter sent from the past. And then she began to write. She wrote with urgency, like the music had waited too long to be born. Like it had clawed at the inside of her ribs for years, waiting for a crack to escape. She didn't eat much, slept even less. The piano in her apartment became her sun and moon. Rosa brought food sometimes. Her mother sat nearby, knitting, humming to herself. Weeks passed, her name stopped trending, but she didn't care. The work was happening. Then came the showcase invitation, Ardent Conservatory's Winter Gala. The same hall her father once dreamed of performing in. The same one Marcus had dominated for decades. She didn't tell anyone how much her hands trembled when she signed the acceptance letter, or how she cried for nearly an hour afterward. Not from fear, but because she finally realized this wasn't just about proving something anymore. This was about building something no one could take. The night of the performance arrived, and the city wore its usual winter hush. Outside, snow fell like sifted flour under streetlights. The conservatory was ablaze with gold light, tuxedos and gowns and crystal chandeliers. The kind of room built to make poor people feel small. But Eliza didn't feel small. Not tonight. She walked into the dressing room in a simple black dress her mother had sewn from scratch. No jewels, no designer labels, just elegance shaped by love. The program had listed her name last. A new talent debuting a piece titled Inheritance. She stepped onto the stage to a respectful ripple of applause. Some recognized her from the viral clip, others whispered her name, but most simply waited. The lights warmed her skin. The piano glowed. She sat, closed her eyes, and played. Inheritance was not a showpiece. It didn't try to impress. It told a story of loss, of silence, of fire buried under ashes. It wept in the beginning, but then it rose, climbing with aching grace into something triumphant, not loud, but proud. A celebration of surviving, of reclaiming space in a world that once said not you. When she struck the final note, she didn't wait for applause. She just let it echo. And when the crowd finally stood, when they clapped, when they shouted, when some openly wept, Eliza didn't bow for them. She turned to the side of the stage, where her mother stood in the wings, and she bowed to her, to the woman who kept the heat on, who held her through grief, who let her come home again when the world forgot. Later, backstage, she spotted Marcus. He stood alone, hands in his pockets, watching her through the dressing room glass. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't smirk, just watched. And in his eyes, she saw it, the moment he finally understood. He wasn't the one who had been eclipsed, he was the shadow all along. She didn't notice him follow her until the hallway grew quiet, until the celebration faded into distant echoes behind closed doors, and she stood alone under the soft hum of backstage lights. Her hands, still tingling from the final note of inheritance, trembled slightly. Not from nerves, from the weight of release. And then she felt it, that pull, a presence behind her. The subtle shift in air that lets you know someone is near before they speak. "You finished it," Marcus said. His voice was quieter now, not soft, not gentle, still carved from stone, but something within it had cracked. She didn't turn around immediately, just let her eyes linger on the poster in front of her, one of the older programs displayed in a glass case on the hallway wall. Marcus Vance, years younger, stared back in black and white, smiling confidently, a name etched in prestige. "It was never unfinished," she replied. "It just wasn't yours to end." He stepped closer. "You know, when I heard it again that night, I wasn't just angry," he said. "I was afraid, because I remembered what it felt like the first time I heard your father play it, before I decided he wasn't marketable enough, before I silenced him." Her eyes flicked toward him. This time she faced him fully. "No," she said calmly. "You weren't afraid of his music. You were afraid he didn't need you to be great." He flinched, almost imperceptibly. "But he did need you," she continued, "for mentorship, for opportunity, for acknowledgement, and you punished him for needing you. You called it weakness, but it wasn't. It was trust." Marcus stared at her like he was seeing her properly for the first time. Not as a waitress, not as a prodigy, but as a reckoning. "I didn't know he had a daughter." "No, you didn't bother to." He breathed in through his nose, eyes cast down now. "There's a part of me that wishes I could undo it," he said. "And the other part?" she asked, not letting him off the hook. He raised his eyes again, tired but unflinching. "The other part knows this industry. What it does to talent like yours, what it will do, and I wonder if I saved him from it, even if I killed his voice in the process." The words hung in the space between them like smoke, visible, suffocating, and laced with truth and guilt alike. Eliza stepped forward, closer than before. "My father didn't need saving, he needed someone to fight for him," she said, "and he got me." Marcus nodded once. A silence stretched, the kind that didn't demand to be broken. "I suppose you've made up your mind about me," he said finally, voice even. She paused, and then, with a grace he didn't expect, she answered, "You were a part of the story, but you're not the end of it." She walked past him, her heels echoing lightly down the hallway. But then, just before turning the corner, she stopped. "You said I finished it," she said without looking back. "But you were wrong." He blinked. "What do you mean?" "I didn't finish my father's piece. That night at the gala, that wasn't the end of it." Her voice was steady, rising now like a tide. "I finished him. I finished hiding him, erasing him, letting him disappear without credit, without voice. That's what I ended." Marcus didn't follow her this time. He simply stood there, surrounded by old posters of his own legacy, while hers walked away without needing to look back. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and relentless. The streetlights painted halos on the sidewalk, and the air carried that hush only winter nights could conjure, something between stillness and the edge of change. Eliza wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the cold. A car waited across the street, headlights on. Her mother stood beside it, holding a scarf and smiling through her tears. Rosa leaned out the back window, snapping a blurry picture through laughter, already demanding they go celebrate with hot chocolate and music trivia. But Eliza took one last look at the conservatory, and her breath caught. There, printed on the new program by the entrance, beneath the headline Winter Gala, Emerging Voices, was her name. And under the list of credits for inheritance, it read, "Composed by Eliza Holloway, in memory of Samuel Holloway, beloved father, forgotten genius." She didn't cry, she smiled, because tonight her father's name stood in the light. Because tonight she wasn't just telling his story anymore, she was living her own. And somewhere she swore she could almost hear it. A single piano note in the dark, warm, sure, and waiting. The following weeks unfolded like a dream woven in soft, persistent threads, real but fragile, as if any sudden movement might cause the whole thing to unravel. But it didn't. Eliza had stepped onto a path now paved not with promises, but with proof. The world had seen her. And now, the world wanted more. Her performance at the Winter Gala became more than a sensation. It became a symbol, a story of reclamation, of the daughter who revived the forgotten work of a brilliant, unrecognized father, of the waitress who silenced a maestro with nothing but her hands and her honesty. Music blogs dissected her compositions, magazines featured her as the new soul of the conservatory, and strangers began mailing handwritten letters to the school, thanking her for reminding them why music mattered. But Eliza didn't let the applause sink too deep into her skin. She wore her rising fame like a scarf, not a crown, something to keep her warm, but never something to define her. In the mornings, she practiced alone in the rehearsal hall, not for perfection, but for peace. Her fingers moved through the air like they were chasing a memory they hadn't quite caught yet. Sometimes she played pieces from her father's journals, still deciphering his broken staves and cryptic symbols. Other times she simply closed her eyes and listened, to the building, to the silence, to herself. One morning, as the January light bled softly through the frosted windows, a knock came at the studio door. She turned, surprised. Very few people ever came to find her this early. It was the scout. His name was Conrad, though to Eliza, he would always simply be the man who saw her before the world did. "You're not sleeping again, are you?" he asked, stepping inside, a steaming cup of coffee in each hand. Eliza smiled faintly. "I sleep between measures." He handed her one of the cups, then settled into the second piano bench near the wall. His coat was dusted with snow, and his eyes were tired, but kind. "They're asking for you," he said after a sip. "Who?" "The Philharmonic, and a producer from Horizon Films, and a publisher. They all want rights to your work. They want a debut album, and a tour." Eliza blinked. She didn't answer right away. "I know it's a lot," he added gently, "but it's real." She looked down at her hands, still faintly lined with ink from transcribing the night before. "I just started," she whispered. "You've been starting your whole life," he replied. "This is just the first time people are listening." She turned her gaze to the piano. The keys looked brighter in the winter sun, sharper, as if they too were waiting for her to decide. "I don't want it to become noise," she said finally. "It won't," he replied, "as long as it's your voice in it." Later that afternoon, Eliza stood on the balcony of her new apartment, a modest walk-up near the conservatory, but with 2 windows and a space just big enough for a real upright piano. The city breathed below her, steam rising from rooftops, horns echoing in the canyon of gray buildings. Somewhere below, in a corner coffee shop, her name was being spoken aloud by people who didn't know her. She could feel it, her story circling through strangers, told and retold. But something else was stirring now, a new melody, one that didn't belong to the past. That night she began writing again, only this time it wasn't for her father, it was for herself. The piece came slowly, note by note like drops of rain carving a river. She called it First Light, and it felt right. Not grand, not tragic, not defiant, just true. Like the first breath after winter, like the quiet joy of becoming something you never thought you were allowed to be. The conservatory scheduled her performance 2 months later, a solo recital, her first official headliner. No gala, no backup, just Eliza. The daughter, the waitress, the composer. The audience was full long before the lights dimmed. Journalists, students, critics, her mother, Rosa, sitting front and center, dressed in a borrowed blue gown with too many sequins and a proud grin so wide it could have lit the whole theater. But Eliza noticed only one seat at the back, occupied by a man in a gray coat, Marcus Vance. He sat alone, no entourage, no expression, just watching. The lights fell. Eliza walked to the piano. No announcements, no fanfare. She sat, adjusted her bench, and waited. She let the silence breathe. Then she played. First Light began with a single note held longer than expected. A pause, then another. A soft rhythm like steps across new snow. The melody was hopeful but unsure, like someone learning to smile again. Halfway through, the music shifted, deeper, warmer, daring. A bridge that leapt and soared. It wasn't a declaration, it was a conversation, a reckoning, a release. She didn't play for vengeance, she didn't play for recognition. She played because she could, because the silence no longer owned her, because she had finally learned what her father must have known all along, that music wasn't just what you heard, it was what you survived. When she finished, She looked up. And something strange happened. The crowd didn't move right away. They didn't clap. They just breathed with her. Then, as if waking from a beautiful sleep, they rose. Every single one of them, in unison. Rosa sobbed into her glittery sleeves. Her mother clutched her purse like a rosary. A young boy in the third row whispered to his dad, "I want to play like her." And Marcus, he stood too. Not slowly, not grudgingly. He clapped, not as a mentor, not as a maestro, as a man who had finally learned how to listen. Backstage, Eliza sat alone again, her fingers curled around a bottle of water, her heart still trying to return to a steady rhythm. A knock came. She didn't need to ask who. Marcus stepped inside. Not with arrogance, not with entitlement, just presence. "You've done something I couldn't," he said. She looked at him. "You told the truth," he added, "and made it beautiful." Eliza didn't speak. "I'm retiring," he said softly. "I wanted you to hear it from me." She didn't react. "I don't want my silence to mean nothing," he continued. She finally looked up. "Then make it count," she said. "Start by remembering his name." He nodded once. "Samuel Holloway." She gave a small smile. "Good." He left without another word. And Eliza sat there, letting the quiet wrap around her, not like a void, but like a companion, a partner, a home. Outside, snow had started falling again, but this time it didn't feel cold. It felt like an encore. The days after the recital passed in a golden blur, as if time itself had softened around her. The conservatory lobby, once a silent corridor of polite footsteps and murmured critiques, now echoed with excitement each time she passed. Students nodded with quiet reverence. Professors paused to comment on her phrasing, her composition, her restraint. The custodians left chalk messages on her door. "You made us cry last night." One of them even left a single yellow flower, tucked gently beneath the doorframe. Still, Eliza didn't let it carry her off the ground. She woke early, practiced alone. She kept her apartment plain, her windows open to the music of passing traffic and distant trains. She journaled in the margins of her father's old notebooks, not to mimic his thoughts, but to learn how to write her own beside his. Then one morning, as frost stretched thin across the glass and sunlight broke lazily over the city's shoulders, Conrad called again, but this time his voice held something new, urgency wrapped in awe. "Eliza," he said, "how soon can you get here?" She paused, still barefoot in her kitchen, toast burning quietly in the toaster. "Why?" "There's someone who wants to meet you. And not just meet you, he's offering something that doesn't usually get offered twice." An hour later, she stood inside the conservatory's East Wing conference hall, dressed in a simple gray turtleneck and black slacks, her curls pulled back into a loose knot. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The snow on her coat had barely melted when the doors opened, and in stepped a man whose presence immediately bent the room toward him. He was tall, mid-60s perhaps, with sharp cheekbones and skin the color of old bronze. His eyes were almost unnaturally clear, a blue so pale they seemed to flicker like gas flame. "Eliza Holloway," he said, "I've heard your name more times this week than my own." She smiled softly, unsure of how to stand. He introduced himself as Theodore Wynne, founder of Wynne and Cross Studios, one of the most prestigious classical production companies in the country. His orchestras had played for royalty. His label had launched the careers of 4 Grammy-winning soloists and 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning composers. But none of that made her nervous. What made her nervous was the way he looked at her. Not like a talent scout, but like a man listening for thunder in a silent sky. "I watched your performance 3 times in one night," he said, clasping his hands behind his back as he circled slowly. "Not because I needed to study it, but because I wasn't sure if it was real." She didn't speak. "Most young composers lean into chaos," he went on. "They mistake complexity for depth. But you carry silence like it's part of the music." Eliza swallowed. "I don't like to force it." He stopped walking, looked directly at her. "And that's why I'm here." He handed her a folder, thick and bound in leather. Inside, a multi-year contract, an international tour, a seat as a featured composer with the New York Philharmonic, an album to be produced under her name, a full scholarship to remain at the conservatory, plus an endowment under her father's name, the Samuel Holloway Fund for Underrepresented Voices in Composition. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. "It's not charity," Theodore said quietly. "It's recognition, long overdue." For both of you. She looked up. There's only one condition, he added. The first composition on your album, Inheritance, must be credited the way you performed it to Eliza Holloway in memory of her father. Her breath caught. A world she had never imagined opened in front of her, not like a door, but like a stage. One where she didn't have to play someone else's role. One where the spotlight wasn't something to hide from, but something she could use to illuminate others. Still, a small voice in her asked the question no one else would dare. What if I'm not ready? Theodore's smile was small but genuine. You are. That's why it's terrifying. She didn't answer right away. She left the contract with him and walked home in the falling dusk, her fingers in her pockets, her eyes watching the swirl of winter light bounce off the rooftops. She passed the diner, the same one where she used to wipe down counters at midnight, where Rosa had once told her, "You're not here anymore." The window was fogged, warm with the glow of lamplight and the clatter of dishes. For a moment, she felt that ache again, of simpler survival, of the silence before the symphony. Inside, she found her mother waiting in the kitchen, a pot of lentil soup on the stove, humming some old hymn Eliza half-remembered from childhood. "They offered a fund," Eliza said quietly, setting her bag down, "with his name on it." Her mother's hands froze mid-stir. "They'll pay for other students like him, kids who got told no, kids who never got to be heard." Her mother turned around, her eyes shining but unreadable. "And you?" she asked. "Will they hear you?" Eliza thought for a long moment. "Yes," she said. That night she sat at the piano again. No audience, no lights, just her and the city breathing gently beyond the frosted window pane. She wrote a new piece, this one untitled. It came in whispers, in sighs. It didn't want to be finished. It only wanted to exist. And when she finally signed the contract the next morning, she didn't feel like she was selling something. She felt like she was starting something. 2 weeks later, she stood before the press at the conservatory's grand announcement gala. The media called it a historic moment, a powerful correction to an old injustice. But Eliza didn't talk about injustice in her speech. She talked about memory, about the sound of her father's laughter when he forgot a note, about the worn metronome that ticked beside their kitchen sink, about how silence can bury you if you don't teach yourself how to sing again. And she ended it simply. "There are voices you don't hear on big stages. My father was one of them, but I'm here now, and I'm not playing quiet anymore." The room erupted, flashbulbs exploded, reporters shouted questions. But Eliza didn't flinch. She had become what no one expected. Not just a name, not just a legacy, a beginning. The night before her international debut, Eliza stood in the wings of the Avery Theater in New York, heart drumming like a slow, careful timpani. Outside, banners with her name fluttered in the winter wind, high above a sold-out house. The air inside buzzed with expectancy, and the orchestra warmed up gently. Strings humming, brass sighing low, as if the hall itself was exhaling in anticipation. She wore a simple black gown, no sequins, no shimmer, just fabric that moved like water when she walked. Her hair was pulled back with 2 pins, one silver, one gold, the same ones her mother had worn to her wedding, passed down like a blessing. This was no gala, no showcase. This was hers. The Philharmonic was not just playing for her. They were playing with her. Her composition, Requiem in Sunlight, would open the evening. It was bold, it was new, and it was unapologetically hers. Yet even with all that she had earned, even with the contract, the reviews, the audiences, and the echo of standing ovations trailing behind her across cities, tonight felt heavier. Not with fear, with purpose. Because she knew who was in the audience. Marcus Vance. He had not spoken to her since the night of her recital months ago. No letters, no calls, only his name appearing occasionally in articles about retirement, legacy, and rumors of a memoir in progress. He had withdrawn from the world of performance, but not from attention. Until now, until this night. She stepped on stage not like a rising star, but like a woman bearing the weight of a story she refused to let end in silence. As the conductor raised his baton, the lights dimmed. Eliza sat at the Steinway in the center of the stage, her back to the crowd, her face lit by the warm amber glow above. The hall stilled. She pressed the first chord. Requiem in Sunlight was not mournful. It wasn't dark. It was written for those who had been forgotten and decided to rise anyway. It told a story without begging for sorrow. It bled, Yes, but it bled gold. The opening movement echoed with motifs from her father's earliest sketches, those half-formed phrases he scribbled on receipt paper and napkins. The second movement broke open into something more urgent, defiant, a swelling of strings and brass that sounded like a door kicking open after years of knocking. And the third was for her. A delicate melody on solo piano, no orchestra, no voices. Just one girl, once overlooked, playing a lullaby to the part of herself that had waited in silence far too long. When the final note drifted into stillness, there was a hush deeper than any applause. The audience sat suspended, as if they didn't want to exhale too soon. Then it came, the thunder, not polite, not rehearsed, a wave of sound and standing bodies. But Eliza didn't bow right away. She stood, walked to the microphone, and waited until the applause ebbed just enough. "Before we continue," she said softly, "there's someone here I need to speak to. Not privately, not behind closed doors, but here, where the silence once lived." The audience stirred, cameras rose, murmurs swept the room. She glanced into the front rows, locking eyes with him. Marcus Vance, his hands rested folded in his lap. His face was unreadable. "Maestro Vance," she said, her voice calm. "You once told the world my father's music was unfinished, that his voice lacked refinement, that mine was born of nostalgia." A few gasps in the audience. Journalists began scribbling. Eliza held her breath. "But you were wrong." Marcus stood, not to leave, but to answer. He moved toward the edge of the stage, slowly, his face pale under the lights. The hall watched, breathless. "Eliza," he said, his voice no longer the one that had sliced through gala banter and dominated interviews. It was raw now, stripped of varnish. "I did more than misjudge your father. I erased him, and I tried to do the same to you." She didn't nod. She didn't forgive. She waited. Marcus reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of aged parchment. "I wrote this," he said. "A confession and a dedication. It's going to be printed in my final publication, and I wanted you to hear it before the rest of the world does." He unfolded the page with trembling fingers and began to read. "Samuel Holloway was the greatest composer I ever silenced. I buried his genius under my fear. And his daughter, Eliza Holloway, is the greatest composer to ever teach me what music really is, the sound of truth finally being heard." He paused, eyes wet. "I'm sorry. It was not a grand apology. It didn't erase what had been done. But it was real." Eliza walked to the edge of the stage. They stood only feet apart now. She looked at him and said, "Thank you for not running from the silence this time." And then she turned back to the microphone. "This is what legacy sounds like," she said to the hall. "Not awards, not press, but a name spoken out loud, a truth no longer hidden, a daughter who won't let her father's light fade." The crowd stood again, not just for the music, but for the story, for the reckoning, for the healing. Later that night, after the encore and the photographs and the trembling congratulations from strangers who now called her maestro, Eliza sat alone in the dressing room with her father's metronome ticking softly on the vanity. Tick, tick, tick. She smiled, no longer haunted, no longer hidden. She picked up her notebook, opened to a blank page, and began to write the first few notes of a new piece. Not a requiem, not a waltz, just a melody. And across the top she wrote its title, Truth and Grace. Spring arrived without ceremony. There was no great thaw or riot of blossoms, just the quiet shift, the way sunlight lingered longer on the windowsill of Eliza's apartment, the way the breeze softened, carried hints of lilac and new grass. It was in that hush between seasons that Eliza Holloway prepared for what would become the most defining performance of her life. Carnegie Hall. A venue her father once passed by with reverent silence, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes tracking every banner like a boy staring through a bakery window he couldn't afford to enter. Now his daughter's name stood printed in bold letters across the entrance, Eliza Holloway. Truth and Grace, a tribute to the voices we almost lost. The hall was packed before twilight, not just with the elite, but with teachers, with students, with working people who had scraped together tickets to see the woman who once carried plates but now carried generations in her hands. Rosa came, of course, clutching the edges of her seat like it might lift her into the air. Her mother wore a soft green silk dress and pinned her husband's photo inside the lining, close to her heart. And Marcus Vance was there, seated not in the front row, not in a private box, but in the middle of the crowd. No fanfare, just presence. As the lights dimmed, Eliza waited behind the curtain with the same quiet ritual she had developed since that very first night. Palms over her heart, eyes closed, and one whispered line to herself, "Play for those who never got the chance." Then she stepped into the light. The piano shone under the golden stage lamps. The silence welcomed her like an old friend. She sat, adjusted the bench with a grace born not of nerves, but of reverence, and placed her fingers on the keys. She began not with brilliance, but with breath. Truth and Grace was unlike anything she had written before. It didn't try to dazzle. It didn't try to mourn. It unfolded like a letter, one written slowly, thoughtfully, and read aloud for the first time in a quiet room. The opening movement was soft and low. A lullaby spun from the kind of grief that doesn't scream but lingers in doorways, in old coffee mugs, in the pages of journals no one else reads. It was for Samuel Holloway, not the forgotten genius, but the father who once whispered rhythm into his daughter's ears while making pancakes in a silent kitchen. The second movement grew stronger. Strings joined her, then woodwinds, building harmony around her, like the voices of all those who were denied a seat at the table. Every note felt like a door unlocking, like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to inhale without apology. The third and final movement was a triumph, not loud, not violent, but full, rich, like the sun rising slowly after years of overcast days. It climbed until the entire hall shimmered in the resonance of forgiveness and remembering. And then, just before the final chord, she paused. The silence was deep, alive. And into that breath, she placed the last note, gentle, like a hand laid softly on an old scar. She held it, released it, and let it go. The hall didn't move at first. Then came the sound, an eruption, but not of mere applause. It was something else, a standing, weeping, cheering acknowledgement, as though every person in the room had lived a version of her journey, and through her had been allowed to speak. Eliza rose, but she didn't bow, not yet. She turned slightly, lifting a small wireless mic from the piano lid. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear. "I wrote this piece for the people we never heard," she said. "For the fathers who didn't get a second chance. For the girls who were told to serve the tables instead of sit at them. For those whose silence was never chosen, but inherited." A hush fell again. "My father played music that no one documented. He died without a concert. Without applause, without even a footnote in the programs he inspired. But tonight, he's here. Not in the past, in every note I played." She looked toward the middle of the crowd, toward Marcus. He stood slowly. The audience turned. Eliza nodded once, and he returned it, no longer as rivals or ghosts of legacy, but as witnesses to a truth too long buried. "He made music that mattered," she said, "and so do we." Then finally, she bowed. Not just to the audience, to the memory. To the silence that once ruled her life and no longer did. Backstage, she found Rosa first. Tears stained her cheeks, her mascara a waterfall of joy and disbelief. "Your father would have melted into a puddle," she sobbed, hugging Eliza tight. "I mean it. He'd be so proud, he wouldn't even care if he was ugly crying." Her mother joined a moment later, silent but smiling. She didn't speak. She only touched Eliza's cheek and nodded. And then came the boy. He was maybe 9. Dressed in a slightly oversized suit, one shoe untied. He stood at the edge of the dressing room doorway, wide-eyed and hesitant. "Miss Holloway?" he asked, voice shaking. I play piano too, but I stopped. They said I was too quiet." Eliza knelt, meeting him eye to eye. "What's your name?" "Deshawn," he whispered. "You're not too quiet, Deshawn," she said gently. "Maybe the world's just too loud." He looked down. "Can I start again?" She smiled, reaching into her bag. From it, she pulled out a small, weathered metronome. Just the one her father used, the one that had ticked through every silent night of her childhood. She placed it gently in his hands. "This helped me remember how to begin," she said. "Now it's yours." He held it like treasure. And in that moment, Eliza knew something deeper than applause. She had not just rewritten her story, she had reopened a path. Later that evening, long after the crowd had gone home, Eliza sat alone in the hall, still in her gown, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the piano's lid. She did not need the keys tonight. She needed the silence. Not the old kind, the kind that used to drown her, but the new kind, the kind that listens, the kind that waits. And in that silence, she whispered, "I hear you, Dad." Somewhere, it echoed, not as a sound, as a presence. a legacy at last made whole. Sometimes, the most powerful music comes from silence. Eliza Holloway's journey wasn't about applause or awards. It was about reclaiming something sacred: voice, legacy, and truth. Born into a world that told her to serve instead of shine, she didn't just sit at a piano. She sat inside generations of forgotten genius and dared to speak through her hands. The lesson here isn't just for musicians. It's for anyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. Eliza's story reminds us that greatness isn't granted by titles or pedigrees. It rises from persistence, pain, and purpose. Her father's unfinished melody became a bridge between what was lost and what could still be written. And through her courage to step into the light, she didn't just finish his song, she began her own. We live in a world that often rewards noise over nuance, popularity over purpose. But Eliza chose authenticity. She played softly when others demanded showmanship. She spoke truth when others demanded silence. And because of that, she reached the world in a way that thunder never could. We all carry unfinished music within us, ideas we've buried, stories we were too afraid to tell, dreams we convinced ourselves were impractical. But truth, when held with grace, becomes unstoppable. So if you've ever felt like you were born into someone else's silence, if you've ever been told to stay in the background while others played the lead, remember Eliza. Let your hands tremble. Let your voice shake. But play anyway, because the world doesn't just need more noise, it needs your music. And you don't need a spotlight to start. You just need one note and the courage to let it be heard.